O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Therefore you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Take to heart these words which I enjoin on you today. Drill them into your children. Speak of them at home and abroad, whether you're busy or at rest. Bind them at your wrist as a sign, and let them be a pendant on your forehead. Write them on the doorpost of your houses and gates. So that's the entire one. So Jesus took out the main part of that and says that's the greatest commandment. And I think I mentioned last week, some Jews do exactly what it says there. It says bind them on your wrist and your forehead. So if you ever see a Jewish person with a little tiny black box around their wrist or on their forehead, they're doing what it says in that particular verse. Or if you go to their home, they'll be posted above the door or at the gate when you come into their property. That passage, that verse, because that's the greatest one. So they're basically saying, if you only remember one, it's remember that the Lord is our God alone. You shall love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul. And one of the main things there, too, talks about make sure you teach your children this. They weren't there when we escaped Egypt, so you got to tell them that. They weren't there when we received these commandments, so you have to tell them about them. And eventually all the witnesses are gone, so you need to teach the next generation. So that's why teaching is such an important thing in most religions. It talks about this destruction of the pagans. That's not a very Christian part, because remember, there's no such thing as Christianity at this time. Anyway, it says when you go in, you see any signs of pagan, you destroy that. So if you see any idols to pagan gods, destroy them, whatever. It says that about people, too, even. When it talks about putting a city to doom, that means you kill everybody there. So that's kind of difficult for some people to reconcile, that God would say that, but most people would answer it by saying that's what people did back then, and since everybody did it, they thought that's what God wanted. Also, though, we need to have this identity and be faithful. So the only way we can do that is by making sure all of us believe this and follow this God. So we need to get rid of the other people. Chapter 8 says you're going to go to a place in Egypt, you had to carry your water. This place, it's going to rain in the mountains and that water will come down, so the water will be easier for you to get. It's going to be a nice place. You're going to be blessed, but don't forget that it's God who did all these blessings for you. You're going to have success, but don't ever let that success go to your head. When you are successful, that's not you, it's God helping you be successful. And then in the middle of chapter 9, it reminds you the story of the golden calf. So Moses said, yes, I brought these commandments down, 10 of them, on 2 stone tablets. And when I came down there, I saw that you had made this golden calf. So I was very upset about that, for reasons I told you before about making an image. So that story is retold there. Again, it would have been told once already in Exodus. In chapter 10, it says what Moses does, then he makes 2 new tablets, and God tells him, you take these 2 stone tablets and you build an ark, and you put them in the ark, and you take this ark with you wherever you go. So when you hear about the Ark of the Covenant, that's what it is. It's a structure that was built to put these 2 stone tablets in. And remember, if the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, so the premise of that movie is, what if we ever found the Ark of the Covenant? Historically, it was destroyed many centuries later, around 586 BC. It was around all the way until then. But anyway, it makes for an exciting idea. What if we actually found it? But that's what the ark was. They carry it with them wherever they go for centuries. Wonders of the Lord. Gift of rain. Well, even here, we take rain for granted because usually we get more rain than we have the last year and a half, right? But if you live in the desert, rain is a real gift. And you really recognize how dependent you are on God, because if it doesn't rain for a while, you're in really big trouble. So it talks about that. So that is the end of the first part of Moses explaining what happened in the past. So here's what God did for us. Here's how we got to where we are. I'm not going to be with you much longer, but you need to remember this for where you're going. So then the next section, and the authors just do that. So like in mine, it's got a large Roman numeral 3 above chapter 12, saying, all right, now exposition of the law. So we're going to have more laws here, statutes, commands, whatever you want to use for it. So these are the statutes and decrees which you must observe in the land which the Lord has given you to occupy. And again, if you count those all up, between these 5 books, you wind up with over 600 of them. Profane and sacred meals, what you can eat and what you can't. Remember, Jews have very strict dietary rules, which was one of the first big decisions that Christianity had to make, was, are we going to continue to follow those dietary rules or not? And huge decision. They decided no, didn't have to. That's a huge portion of the New Testament, is the debate on whether to do that or not. Avoid pagan rites. And if you aren't sure about what you can and can't eat, again, it's mentioned in one of the earlier books. It's mentioned here again in chapter 14. So if you ask a Jew, I remember Muslims don't eat pork either, but if you ask them, why not? They would say, well, it says not to twice in the Bible, back in Exodus and then here in Deuteronomy 14. So it lists all the things you can eat, like ox, so cattle, sheep, goats, deer, all those things are fine. But then it gives a list of the things you're not supposed to eat, like camel, rabbits or hares, badgers, and pigs. And then it gives reasons for why. And then it gives a list of birds, what you can and can't eat. Insects, what you can and can't eat. So if you want to read through those, that's up to you, but if you want to follow a strict Jewish dietary practices, that would be your guide.
How did they decide that? They just sit around talking and that's not every.
Okay, so in case you're listening, somebody asked, how did they decide that? Well, again, people give different answers. The simplest answer would be, that's what God said. Okay, so a fundamentalist would simply say, well, God said it right there and that other place, so he said it twice. Some people say, well, you know what? You can probably do some figuring. Maybe somebody ate this animal once and got sick from it. You know what? That's God's way of telling you you're not supposed to eat it. It's very possible.
Same way with my medicine.
As someone who raises pigs on a farm, I could tell you that I probably would not want pigs in the desert because water is very limited, and what are pigs going to do if they get by water? They're going to make it so you can't use it. So the last animal you want around water is probably a pig, so that would make sense. So I try to give common sense answers whenever, and I think that's a common sense answer to that. And they say, since pigs do that, yeah, we don't want them around. God must not want us to have those. And another one could also be pagans have pigs. Our enemies have pigs, so we should probably stay away from them. So any or all of those might be your answer. Debts, chapter 15 is interesting. Boy, if we followed those, what would we do? It says that if you loan money to somebody after 7 years, it's written off. Yeah. If someone basically volunteers to be your slave, okay, 6 years, but then they're free after that. The 7th year, they're free. All that. If you ever hear of the Jubilee year, it's 7 times 7, 49. The next year, the 50th year, all debts are done. So again, it's because the accumulation of wealth by some at the expense of others was frowned upon. Okay, so if somebody's really poor, well, after 7 years, you forgive their debts. And it gives some other examples of it in there. We don't want needy. You can avoid need by forgive your debts every 7 years. Okay. What are the major holy days for Jews? Now you can go into one of the books and it goes through them all. And we'll do that later on. But it mentions the 3 most important ones in chapter 16. The Feast of the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths, all of which are about a week long. So the Passover, of course, is the most important one. It's the one Jesus and his apostles were celebrating on what we call Holy Thursday. All right, it's where you commemorate the escape from slavery in Egypt. Because what did we do on that night? We were told to prepare a special meal of lamb and other things. And I did at one parish. If anybody really wants to do something like that on Holy Thursday, if we want to have a Passover meal here, we could. But it's basically roasted lamb is the main part, and it talks about the other things. But anyway, remember that every year. You do that for a week. The reason there were so many people in Jerusalem the week that Jesus died is it was Passover week. And later on, it was said during Passover week, if possible, you should go to Jerusalem. So the population of Jerusalem tripled at least during Holy Week because people went there for that occasion. Anyway, so it talks about the sacrifice, the Passover, because the angel passed over the places of the Jews, and then they escaped the next day. Festival of Weeks, kind of like Thanksgiving. But anyway, count off 7 weeks. So that's 49. The next one, 50. So 50 days. Basically, it works like 50 days after the harvest has started. You give thanks, which is kind of what Thanksgiving was probably originally about 50 days after the first harvest, if you think about it. So anyway, we do something like that. And the Feast of Booths, booth is kind of a strange word. It's a tent. So when they told Jesus on Mount Transfigure, we'll make 3 booths here. Yeah, 3 tents. So Feast of Booths refers to remembering the time you spent in tents in the desert. So people who follow that literally, once a year, even if you're a very well-to-do Jew, in your backyard, you'll pitch a tent and live in that for a few nights so that we never forget what our ancestors went through. Okay, you appoint judges and officials so you can have true justice. They're going to interpret all these laws, avoid pagan worship, sacrifice, and so on. And then there's more examples of bad things there in chapter 17, things you're not supposed to do. Chapter 18, we got some rules for priests. Okay, Levi was one of the 12 tribes, and it's from that tribe that the priests come from. So the Levites have special rules and special cities for them. Aaron, Moses' brother, was a Levite. So here's special rules for the priest. Later on, there's prophets, so it talks about prophets. Chapter 19 says cities of refuge. What is a place of refuge? Well, we still have that today. The Bible talks about refuge and sanctuary. What's a wildlife refuge? What's a wildlife sanctuary? You can't hunt there. Okay, it's off limits to killing there. So that's what these cities of refuge are. No fighting there. And they specifically had them if you accidentally killed somebody, which apparently happened reasonably often back then. If you accidentally killed somebody, you went to a city of refuge, and the relatives of the other person you killed can't kill you. Because remember, they believe in the eye for an eye, so you will otherwise kill somebody. So if it's an accident, you go live there. False witnesses, at the end of chapter 19, talks about what to do if somebody lies. What you're supposed to do in war, what to do to cities of the enemy. Kind of interesting, the end of chapter 20, you don't destroy the trees of a city that you destroy. So it's kind of nice if you're an environmentalist, but it would make sense to keep trees because trees were at a premium in the desert as well. They even say, like in chapter 20, what if you find a body? What do you do? Well, you mark off what's the closest city here, and then people from that city take care of it. Anyway, it describes exactly how to do that. What if you marry a female captive? It talks about that. Firstborn of, what were the rights of the oldest born? Remember back then, the oldest son always got the bequests. Okay, so it talks about that. What happens if the dad doesn't like his oldest son the best, or if the oldest son's really stubborn or whatever? It talks about that. What if you lose your property, meaning your animals, which are your most valuable possession back then? So it talks about what to do with those. If you really want to get into things in middle of chapter 22 there, it talks about how you're supposed to dress. Okay, so if you want to go back to back then, it talks about that. You don't mix seed when you grow seed. You don't take eggs away from a bird that's still nesting them, and so on. So things like that. A bunch of stuff about marriage. If you think your wife has been unfaithful, it tells you what to do. And then what happens for a lot of crimes, people are stoned to death. Well, they didn't have prisons back then, and they figured if you did something really bad, you should be killed. And the easiest way to kill somebody, there's plenty of rocks, so you literally had people go and throw rocks at them until they died. Okay, 23, you're a member of a community, your tribe. Cleanliness, very important then. A lot of that was health, and they attached religious meaning to it. So, if you touch something that's dead, here's what you got to do, and so on. More laws about marriage in chapter 24. And in chapter 25, what about Levites that are married? And remember, at one time they asked Jesus, what happens if somebody dies and doesn't leave children? Okay, where does it say that? Well, here in chapter 25 there, it talks about if the husband dies, a widow shall not marry anyone outside the family, but her husband's brother should perform the duty for the older brother. So that's where they got, the people that were questioning Jesus about that, that's where they got that from chapter 25. Chapter 26, Thanksgiving for the harvest. So remember, that's one of the key parts of almost any religion is you give thanks. You give thanks for what you have, and harvest is one of the main things to give thanks for. And that's one nice thing that is, those of us in smaller parishes, we do that pretty well. If you're a rural area, we pray for the crops early in the year and give thanks for them at the end of the year. We'll probably do that sometime after the harvest is finished here. Tithes, T-I-T-H-E, you give tithes. So part of what you produce, you're supposed to give to the Levites for sacrifice or offer to God. The Levites were priests, so they didn't work like others. They offered sacrifice on behalf of the people. So you would bring part of your harvest to the priest and say, give this to God for me. And the priest knew how to do that then. Second half of chapter 27 is what are called the 12 curses. So Moses says, cursed be, for example, cursed be anyone who dishonors father or mother. And the people all said, amen, meaning, yes, so be it, I believe that. So here's 12 specific things you're not supposed to do. You'll be blessed if you obey, but you'll be cursed if you disobey. Reminder of the plagues and exile, some things there in 28. Chapter 29, remembering some things from the past again, so as not to forget that. Several times it talks about how Moses defeated Sihon and Og. Warning against idolatry. One of the worst violations is to do idols. Infidelity means unfaithfulness, being unfaithful to God. No, the whole purpose of this covenant is we're supposed to be faithful to God. All right, now we're going to go way back to Abraham. God promised Abraham two things, descendants and land. Okay, so we gave him Isaac as his son. And Isaac had Jacob, and then Jacob had 12 sons. Okay, so the descendants are safe now. We've got plenty. So that was pretty immediate. But land, long time. It's been centuries since God said to Abraham, someday this land will be yours. But that's going to be fulfilled pretty soon here. It's going to be in just a matter of weeks in all likelihood by this time, according to how Moses is speaking. The only thing is, Moses is going to die pretty soon. If you read it, it says it's because once there was a time where he was supposed to strike a rock and water come out, and he did it twice. Well, he's also probably just old. But it's probably very likely that people wonder, this guy was so great, he did all this stuff. God, why did he die before he got to see us get into the place he was talking about? Must have been something he did. He must have done something to irritate God. That's my view of that anyway. But Moses,
Because he didn't trust God,
Yeah.
it once was enough.
that's what those,
That's
that's
yeah.
what the story says. So if you go by the story, that's it. Otherwise, he may have just died of old age. But anyway, one way or the other, they're trying to answer the question, which I'm sure if you tell this story to your kids, they're going to say, "Oh, why didn't Moses die before they made it there?" So there's an answer.
But they seem to always have bad things happen to you, you did something wrong.
Yes, that was
You were
always.
cursed. Or
Yes.
if you were barren, you did something wrong.
Yeah. That's still the thought of everybody at the time these things are written. Whenever something bad happens to you, it's because you must have done something to irritate God.
They weren't faithful.
And
Not like us.
remember, it's not until Jesus' time where Jesus says, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You can know that from experience. So we need to know what's going to happen. Who replaces Moses then? Well, remember, one of those two guys that gave the positive scouting report was Joshua, and Joshua has also been his main assistant along the time anyway. So it's pretty obvious it's going to be Joshua. So in chapter 31, it says, the call of Joshua, Moses says, basically, be firm, steadfast, you're going to continue this. He gives him the law to remember all of it, and then commissions Joshua. And then it talks about he is commissioned in front of all the people. So otherwise you have a major problem here on descendants. So, hey, it's got to be Moses specifically, said Joshua. And there doesn't seem to be argument against it. They accept Joshua as their next leader. Then it says at the end of 31, the law is placed in the ark, so we're ready to travel. But when we go to the promised land, we've got to take the ark with us, so that's that. Chapter 32 is called the Song of Moses. You can tell by how it's indented there in poetic form. And at the end of chapter 32, it says Moses views Canaan. So Canaan is this land, which we call Israel today, or the Promised Land, or Palestine, all different names for it. He views it. It says he gets to go up on a mountain. It's on the other side of the river that you see there. So he can see it, but he doesn't enter it. And remember, Martin Luther King used that analogy for himself with civil rights in the 1960s. He said, I'm on the mountain, I can see it, but I probably won't get there with you, because he thought there was a pretty good chance he would die, which he did. He was assassinated shortly after. But he said, I can see better times coming for civil rights. Anyway, he used analogy from Moses here. Before a really important person dies, he blesses the people. So that's what chapter 33 is. And then in chapter 34, it says he dies, and they mourn for 30 days. So we're going to wait for a month before we move on to remember Moses. And it is kind of neat there. It says they bury him where nobody knows. Probably because they figured if people know, they'll all want to go there and visit it and desecrate it or whatever. So it says nobody knows where he was buried. And now Joshua is filled with the spirit of wisdom, and it is he who will lead the people into the promised land. So that is a summary of Deuteronomy, but also kind of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. Those stories are in there. And later on, we'll go over them a little bit more. But this is what the people believe about their past. And now, when we get to the time of Joshua and the Judges, we know more, because it's more recent. And then after Judges, when we get into the book of Samuel and Kings, then we know a lot more, because we're getting close and there's written records. But this is the faith history of the people. This is their beliefs about how God made a covenant with them, took them out of slavery in Egypt, got them through 40 years in the desert, and got them to the promised land through the leadership of Moses and Joshua. And now Joshua will get them into the promised land, where they are the fulfillment of that second promise, descendants and land. And now it's our job to be faithful. So when you do a covenant, God promises land and descendants. What do we promise in return? Fidelity, faith to God. And the story of the next several books will be about how sometimes they're faithful and many times they're not. So that is a little bit of the introduction of the Bible and the time of Moses, especially as seen in the book of Deuteronomy. which I did in just about exactly an hour. I started at 7:07 and now it's 8:05. Okay. So, questions, Les?
Question back to the calf that they built. Was that supposed to be Moloch, or was that false god known at that time of Moloch?
Possibly, very possibly. The golden calf, well, yeah. Some
Baal or
some
what?
cultures probably worship something like that. So, don't know. But the point is, you're not supposed to worship any image.
So why do we have statues then? Is that,
Later on, it's just how history changes.
okay,
So we said,
don't
so the
worship.
question
We
was,
don't
why do
worship,
we
we
have
don't worship.
statues today? Well, we don't worship the statue.
Yeah.
no, we don't worship the statue,
They're a reminder of something we believe.
yes.
So a statue of Jesus is a reminder of our faith. Many of you maybe have a picture of your spouse in your wallet, you know. You're not worshiping your partner, but you remember him or her. You have a picture to remember him or her. So the meaning is totally different than it was back then. We aren't worshiping that. It's a reminder of our faith. Did you have something before? Someone else said. Okay, anybody else before we go? Okay, then we'll go ahead and shut this off and we'll talk about when to do it next.
Diane, you're so handy.